So the first aspect I would stress is the changes in the institutional system and in the decision-making system. Essentially, the proposal takes away unanimity from all over the European Union institutional system. So the basic idea is that all the decision has to be taken by qualified majority or super qualified majority, but without having any veto power by any member states anymore. So that we cannot see again the whole union being kidnapped by one member state that sometimes put a veto on an issue only in order to get his way on something completely different, only exploiting the unanimity rule. So this would be a boost for European democracy, but also for European efficiency in the decision-making system.
I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
Iam europeană.
Európai polgár vagyok.
Eu sou europeia.
Jag är en medborgare i Europa.
Jag som europeanka.
Yo soy ciudadana del continente europeo.
Jestem Europejczykiem.
Esu europiete.
Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja graștancă Europei.
Ja romaniancă Europei.
Esu europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.
Dear listeners to the European Citizens Radio, this is again Ulrike Guérot with a new format and a new podcast of the European Citizens Radio. Today, again, we are having a guest, and I do this in English. We are trying to do as many European languages as we can. My guest today is from Italy. He's sitting in Italy, and my Italian is just pochito, so I can't do the conversation in Italian. I will do it in English. First of all, Roberto, welcome to be here.
Thank you so much, Ulrike, for the invitation.
For our listeners, who is Roberto Castaldi? Roberto Castaldi is first a friend of mine. We know since a long while, because it's a long while that the European Union needs institutional reform. So we have been signing, I don't know how many manifestos together, basically arguing that we should have institutional reform and that the European Union needs to reform. And this is basically which brought us together in a couple of conferences over the past decade. And then we lost a little bit track because of the pandemic, which all activities were a little bit frozen. But now the European Union is coming back to action. And I'm speaking with Roberto Castaldi because he's one of the best Italian specialists on EU institutional reform. Roberto is a professor for political theory. He is specialist on European integration topics, and he is sitting at Campus University in Novedrate, and he's also the director for Euractiv Italy. For our listeners, Euractiv Italy is a huge European media platform which is getting news, giving news, podcast news, but also electronic news and news feed on European topics. It exists in many European languages. By the way, there's also Euractiv Germany. So if you are interested in European topics, Euractiv is a good place to go if you want to go deeper into this stuff. So today, the stuff we are talking about will be a little bit technical and tricky, but we will try to make it as sort of easy to understand as we can. Roberto, I'm talking with you about treaty change amendments. We are sitting in Italy and Berlin, and we are now looking at proposals of the European Parliament which have been brought up by a group of people in August and which are basically envisaging huge treaty change reforms. If I'm not mistaken, these proposals are being brought up by different parties. So there is the European Social Democrats, there's the European People's Party, there's also the European Left, and there are the European Greens. So it's a prestigious project. It's not a partisan issue. So there's obviously a coalition-building issue in which several European parliamentarians want to have an in-depth treaty change for the time time after the European elections. So again, for our listeners, European elections is 9th of June next year. So there is really something in work in the European Parliament. Roberto, can you perhaps explain first to our listeners what is in these proposals? I mean, what are the key issues that these deputies were coming up with, and they say, look, now is really time that the European Union needs to reform, what they are suggesting?
Many things, and the first thing to mention is that this proposal is not coming out of the European Parliament alone, because the Parliament has set itself the task to translate the proposal of the citizens coming from the Conference on the Future of Europe that require treaty amendment, to turn them into official treaty amendment proposal. And this is what the Parliament has done. And as the Conference on the Future of Europe had 9 priorities and dealt with policies and institutional issues, democracy and so on, so also the proposal from the Parliament covers all these issues. I would suggest to split them in basically 3 aspects. The first one is...
Let me just, may I interrupt you? Let me just perhaps signal to our listeners, for those who are not informed. Indeed, there has been a huge conference on the future of Europe, which has been organized by the European Commission and the European Parliament together. It lasted for more than a year. It was launched on 9th of May, which is the European Day 21. For 1 year, European citizens were interviewed. There were several citizens' assemblies taking place in, I think, Lisbon and Dublin, at various places, and ordinary citizens were meeting and talking about what they wish for the future of Europe should be and what proposals they want to see change. And this was moderated by the European Commission, I think in a rather professional way, and all these proposals were condensed in a report. The report was presented to public in 9th of May 22, so 1 year later, and then this report, which is basically combining 49 citizens' proposals, has then been passed to the European Parliament. And Roberto, what you are now saying is that several parties, several MEPs took up these citizens' proposals to basically put them into the parliamentarian process and to make an institutional reform agenda out of them.
Absolutely. Some of the proposals were taken up by the Commission into normal European legislation because this could be done within the current treaty. Some of the proposals could not be followed up within the current treaties, so they required treaty change, and the Parliament took upon itself to present them. So the first aspect I would stress is the changes in the institutional system and in the decision-making system. Essentially, the proposal takes away unanimity from all over the European Union institutional system. So the basic idea is that all the decision has to be taken by qualified majority or super qualified majority, but without having any veto power by any member states anymore, so that we cannot see again the whole union being kidnapped by one member state that sometimes put a veto on an issue only in order to get his way on something completely different, only exploiting the unanimity rule. So this would be a boost for European democracy, but also for European efficiency in the decision-making system. The second aspect is the strengthening of the supranational institution, because the extension of the ordinary legislative procedure means that all the legislative decision will be taken through a co-decision between the European Parliament, which is the only directly elected institution of the European Union, and the Council of the EU, where the representative of the member states sit, but deciding by qualified majority. So this would extend the ordinary legislative procedure basically to all European competencies. Finally, it would strengthen the European Commission, even changing its name into European Executive. And it would abolish the presidency of the European Council, which is the meeting of the head of states and government of the member states, that would be chaired by the president of the European Executive, what was the Commission so far. So this way, it tries to create a clearer form of government in the EU, a parliamentary form of government where the Commission becomes the executive, which is responsible in front of the Parliament, which would take a major role in deciding and electing the president of the Commission. So it would resemble more what we are used to in traditional democracies, Because one of the issues that is often complained regarding the EU is the fact that it is difficult for citizens to understand. With this reform, it would be much easier for citizens to understand because it would resemble a more traditional parliamentary democracy, a federal democracy, where the only elected chamber of the legislative, the European Parliament, would have a key role in defining the president and therefore the priorities of the executive. So the Commission would change name in the executive, and this would clarify, of course, for the citizen what is the real role of the European Commission. So these are the main institutional issues.
Let me chime in. Thanks for basically describing these huge changes, because I just need to underscore that what Roberto just told us is really sort of big business. I mean, both of us know, because we have been doing this sort of institutional reform stuff, writing about it since 10 or 15 years, you know, the EU should, the EU should, the EU should. There was so many complaints about the lack of democracy and participation in the institutions of the European trilogy or the European governance system. There's a huge complaint about, as Roberto just said, hijacking council conclusions and other by a veto of a member state. So there was always the strive for how can we overcome this deadlock in the European institutional system. But Roberto, for those who are, let's say, sitting in, be it Berlin or Milano or be it Lyon, and who are not sort of eating and dying and smelling the European stuff every day, you know, like us. And this is a highly complex sort of, what do I care for European institutions? Why is this important? I mean, does my future depend on it? Does my life depend on it? I mean, let's break it down to the vision of a 25-year-old European citizen sitting somewhere in Europe these days, and he's now trying to understand, okay, a unanimity, qualified majority, where were these the problems before, and why is it in the future no more a problem? Can you give perhaps 2 or 3 examples? Absolutely. Where these mechanisms, yeah? Okay.
Let's make 2 big examples. We have a war in Europe, in Ukraine, and we have huge geopolitical tensions all around Europe, from the Caucasus to the Middle East to North Africa. Today, we take most decisions in foreign security and defense policy by unanimity, which means we don't take any decision. We hope that the US or China or Turkey or even the Vatican takes a diplomatic initiative for peace, a truce, a ceasefire, whatever. And we, Europeans, are unable to take any significant stand. We are a bystander, onlooker, but we are not an actor in foreign security and defense policy, even when our own security is at stake, because of unanimity, because of veto power. So this is a crucial issue. By taking away veto power, it means that we will finally, hopefully, be able to take a stand on foreign security policy. And in this regard, another of the proposal of treaty change is the setup of a European defense union with European armed force under the command of the European executive, with a rapid reaction force. That is something that has been decided already in 1999 by the Helsinki European Council and was never implemented. So it's something that we decided 25 years ago almost, and we never did. Why? Because of unanimity and the fact that when we had to decide how to do it and so on, we require unanimity, and there was always somebody that disagreed about the way to do it and so on and so forth. So this is a crucial issue. Another example, fiscal policy today is decided by unanimity. So we are discussing about the European budget and own resources, and it's enough that one country doesn't agree and everything is stopped. We have a fiscal paradise, fiscal heavens in Europe. And this was because it was impossible to get those member states that have this kind of legislation to agree with the common standard regarding, for instance, taxation on big enterprises and so on, or for taxation about digital companies. Today, we have multinationals like Google that their employees within Europe pay more taxes than Google itself. Why? Because we don't have an harmonized tax on corporate, on big corporations. So when we are discussing about these things,
which was by the way one of the proposals from the European citizens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the European citizens claimed exactly for this, taxation of European.
The European Parliament is proposing to decide by qualified majority so that we finally can get a decision about this issue. Also, there is discussion, and there is in this proposal the creation of more own resources by the European Parliament that are already on the agenda. And I would like to stress that when we discuss about European taxation, is marvelous because it's not to tax the people that always pay the taxes like in the member states, but to tax those realities, those entities that today manage to avoid to pay taxes at the national level. Because when we are discussing about European taxation, we are discussing about the carbon tax, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the digital tax, the financial transaction tax. What does this mean? That we are going to tax those that are polluting, which means that they put on the shoulder of society the negative externalities of their production by polluting, and then we have to pay the cost of health and so on that comes from pollution and of climate change and all these things. The same for people that want to export their goods in Europe without keeping their environmental standard that we are putting in place in Europe, and this is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which means that this way we create an incentive also outside the EU. If you want to enter the European market, you need to keep high environmental standard and reduce pollution, otherwise you are taxed on this. The digital tax, which is a way to tax the big digital corporation, the platform that today makes billions of euros out of the single market, but pay ridiculous taxes. And the financial transaction tax, which is not a tax on all financial transactions, but only on short-term speculative one, which means that we are going to tax the big finance that today makes, again, billions of euros out of the European single market, but is not paying taxes because finance taxes very, very little. So this way we can raise revenue to provide European public goods. And the reason why we were unable to do that is the fact that there was always one country or another country that on one or the other of this issue had a specific advantage because they were made an agreement with Google and Facebook. So they put their seat for the whole of Europe. They pay very, very little taxes only in that country, but for that country was still very much. But if we had a single European tax, then it's irrelevant if you put it in Dublin or in the Netherlands, in Milan, or whatever,
in Amsterdam or wherever
you go. Yeah. So you cannot hide away, you cannot make a side deal with a member states, and you cannot cheat the European citizen, extracting data, extracting money, but without paying taxes.
This is a very important point, and also for making this, let's say, a little bit more visualizing, for anybody sitting in Bordeaux or in Thessaloniki or in Barcelona. Everybody knows that there are tax paradises, basically Luxembourg, but especially also Ireland. Ireland had a super sort of special regulation with particularly low company taxation, which were lower than 20% than average sort of company taxation in Europe, which led to the fact that many big companies had their central of the firm, the headquarter basically in Dublin, and so paid ridiculously low taxes for having access to the whole single market and the whole sort of Euro zone. And the same a little bit, I heard about this story that a big high-tech company, American company, moved to Amsterdam, and because the cities are so keen to get these headquarters in their towns, because then they have lots of jobs for all these high potentials doing digital and social media work, the city of Amsterdam accepted to basically get no taxes, just the jobs. So the trade-off war, let's get the jobs but not pay no taxes. And if we can now cut through with everything that Roberto explained to us, that you can no longer cheat the European Union on taxation on the level of the companies, then you can no longer cheat the European citizens. And this is why it's interesting for you, all the listeners of European Citizens Radio. That's how we call this radio, European Citizens Radio, because we want a European democracy. We do not want to be cheated on taxation, and we want public goods for Europe. And public goods for Europe, that could be, for instance, a railway and trains going from, say, Copenhagen to Barcelona, or going from Budapest to Paris. We want to be climate neutral. We need these infrastructure programs, and they need to be financed. So it's a very important thing to work on these taxation things and on these institutional issues, even though I admit they may appear a little bit dry. But I think the European Union is really moving to the core essence of what it wants to be, which is a functioning political place with democratic accountability, and where the cheating is no longer possible. You agree, Roberto?
Absolutely. And on what you said, there are two other things that I would like to stress. The first is that in this proposal, the European Union would have fiscal power and the possibility to do debt like we did for the Next Generation EU after the pandemic. Now we did it ad hoc, and the idea is that this should become a structural power for the EU, because we need investment for the green and digital transition, to fight climate change, and to produce European public goods. And these need to be decided democratically. So with qualified majority vote in the Council and with the Parliament taking full responsibility and co-deciding on this. Because today we have a paradox. You'll remember that the American Revolution was done on the motto, no taxation without representation. In Europe, we have representation without taxation, because the Parliament can decide about the expenditure of the Union, but cannot decide about the revenue of the Union, which is decided by the member states alone. This has no place in a democracy, that the only directly elected institution has no role in deciding the amount of the budget, the revenue of the budget, the way that we want to get the revenue. With this reform, we would finally overcome this huge democratic deficit. And the other very important element about democracy, I would like to stress two. The first one is that the reform provides for the setting up of a European referendum. So a new tool for direct democracy in Europe. The Conference on the Future of Europe was the first experiment of participatory democracy, and now with this reform we would also have a direct democracy tool at the European Union level, recognizing the European citizen as such. This would be an important step which was asked by the citizens in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And the second element is the fact that today we have a requirement to be a democratic state with the rule of law to join the Union, but we do not have effective instrument to ensure that the rule of law and democracy are not undermined in a member state after it had joined the EU. And what has been happening in Hungary and Poland, for example, regarding the demolition of the autonomy of the judges and so on, has been astonishing. And this reform provides for a dramatic change to strengthening the possibility for the Union to intervene to defend European citizen rights in their own countries. For example, today we require unanimity by all the member states for any kind of decision regarding the defense of rule of law in another country, which means that Hungary puts a veto regarding any provision against Poland and vice versa. So we cannot do anything nor about Poland nor about Hungary. With this new reform, this decision will be taken by qualified majority and will be taken on a decision by the European Court of Justice. And this is the other supranational institution that is strengthened. By qualified majority voting, the member state can ask the Court of Justice to decide, having heard the member states' concern, of course, if there really is a violation of fundamental rights and values by a member state. And if the court, the judge, decided that there is such a violation, then it's possible to impose sanction that can be financial sanction related to stop of payment by European Union program, budget, and so on, up to the blocking the possibility for the member states to fully participate and vote in the Council, or to take the rotating presidency of the Council. So very significant penalties. And this will be decided on the basis of an evaluation which is not political, is not done by ministries, by the national states, but by the European Court of Justice.
Okay, let me chime in here and just to basically reduce it down, boil it down for our listeners. Yeah, basically we were talking about two big things in which the European Union could be democratized if the proposals now at the table of AFCO, which is the institutional committee of the European Parliament, but then in the plenary of the European Parliament, the voting is 9th of November, and if those go through, what Roberto has been explaining to us.
Plenary, so between the 20th and the 23rd of November will be voted in the plenary.
Okay, 2021. So it's already through AFCO, so the first step has been taken, and 2021st November, we will watch this vote carefully in the European Parliament. There will be the plenary vote. But boiled down, everything that Roberto just said is that in two very distinct features of democracy, which is first voting and second taxation, there are huge changes ahead if these proposals go through. In terms of voting, we are undercutting the majority rule, and you will basically have a system which is one person, one vote, in which you have an aggregated European vote, and resistance will no longer be possible. That's the one thing. And the second is that with terms of taxation, you mentioned this American saying, no taxation without representation. Basically, we are having a system in which if we are having tax contributions on the European level, there is and must be a system of European representation in which the citizens are in. So basically, we are linking the taxation issue to the voting issue, and we are equalizing this on the level of European citizens. And so even though I may guess that those who listen to us today are not so informed in the institutional details of this, long-lasting process of institutional reform, you may understand that there's a lot of at stake. As Roberto said it, what is at stake is that we shift the European system, which is a speciality in its own. Most of the time, it's called sui generis, with decision-making structures which do not resemble to a, say, national democracy, that we are shifting these decision-making structures towards a European democracy in which the two principles, no taxation without representation and one person, one vote, are obviously both linked. So if we succeed to do this on the European level, Roberto, I think that's the essence of what you explained, we are making a huge step forward in shifting the European system towards a democratic system alike any national democracy.
Yes, but not as a national democracy, but as a federal democracy. Because, for example, the European referendum recognized the federal nature of the European Union and provide for a double majority. Like, for instance, in Switzerland. Switzerland is a federal system that is that used direct democracy very much. Is one of the countries that use direct democracy the most in the world, and the federal referendum in Switzerland require a majority of the people and a majority of the cantons. The same for the European...
Like in Germany, yes. It's also the Federal Republic of Germany and the Federal Republic of Austria, where you always have two chambers, combining the vote in the assembly with the regional chamber.
Yeah, the European Parliament and the Council as the two chambers of the legislative, and European referendum to be approved will require that there is a majority at European level of all the European citizens, but also national majorities in a majority of member states. So this way we recognized the federal nature of the Union, because how the European Union is made up, we have some big member states and some small member states. If we only consider a majority at European level, we could have that a wide majority in the 5 largest member states would make up for a majority, even if all the other 22 member states were radically against. Of course, this would not be probably considered fully democratic, because the EU is not a nation state, would be a federal system. So with this provision that we need both a European majority and a national majority in a majority of member states, we are ensuring that there is a balance which is coherent with the federal nature of the European Union. And also...
So this is to explain, but this finding the equilibrium between the population's sort of impact on decision-making, sort of the power of the people, and the state representation, has been, I guess, since the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the Nobel Prize-winning sort of question for the European system to be reformed. There were endless talks about weighted voting procedures and the impact of the countries and the impact of the citizens or the people, because the European Union in itself is a union of states and a union of citizens. It has a double pillar structure, and the system always needs to correspond to the two angles. But Roberto, as you touched upon precisely this very important point when it comes to democracy, let's come to what is one of the essences in this proposal, which is now hanging in the European Parliament, which is indeed need the revision of the decision-making procedures when it comes to a new convention. If I'm not mistaken, one essence of the proposal is to say that there are already deliberations in the European Parliament, that after the European elections next year, 9th of June, there should be a convention. This convention is supposed to start in September 24 in Athens. There's a huge preparatory work. There's also the European University Institute already engaged. So there might be a convention which integrates the proposals of the European citizens to then come to a conclusion and an overarching report, convention report, about the two big questions of the European future. How can we combine the next round of enlargement with something called deepening or democratization? Because we are talking about Ukraine membership of the European Union. There are the Baltic states which are waiting since long to join the European Union. There's also the Turkish question still around, because at some point the European Union started negotiated about accession with the European Union, although these negotiations have been suspended. So there's a huge sort of wave or wake of enlargement coming. Some people are talking about that the European Union may see something like 36 or 37 member states in some time soon. And it's clear that under current institutional conditions, the European Union cannot cope with this. So there must be a deepening sort of debate. And all this is tackled or shall be tackled, as I am informed, in a European convention. Now, the crucial question is, let's assume we get this convention. Let's assume we get a good result on what this convention will do, combining deepening with widening. And then the results of this convention will need to be voted. And you have been, I think, shaping very innovative formulas so that we can have a vote about these convention results without being blocked on sort of deadlocking strategies. Can you explain that to us?
First, split the point you mentioned that are four and are complex for our listeners, so we better take it one by one. The first one is the process. If the current treaty provides the European Parliament with the power to propose amendment to the treaty. So if the Parliament in the plenary between the 20th and the 23rd of November will vote this proposal, at this point the European Council, the meeting of the head of state and government, by simple majority can decide to convene a convention. The convention is an institution of the European Union to reform the treaties that includes the national government, the Commission, the European Parliament, and the national parliaments, and can also have a representative of civil society. So it's a very broad and representative institution, similar to some extent to the Conference on the Future of Europe, that will be tasked with examining the formal proposal made up by the Parliament. So if the Parliament approves this proposal, this will be the basis, the basic text on which the next convention will have to decide. The Spanish presidency of the Council has committed to transmit the proposal straight away to the European Council. So next December, at the European Council meeting, by simple majority, the Council may decide to convene a convention. What is likely, in my view, is that the European Council will decide to convene a convention in January 2025, because in January 2025, we will have the new Parliament elected on the 9th of June 2024, but also the new Commission that will be elected in autumn 2024 and that will start its mandate on 1st January 2025. So my expectation would be that the European Council may decide to convene a convention, but postponing its start to the beginning of 2025. Then, as the expectation is that the enlargement will hopefully take place in 2030, it means that this reform needs to enter into force to have legal effect before the enlargement, so by 2029 at the latest. So this European legislature, 2024.
By 2029?
Yes, because if the enlargement takes place in 2030, it means that this reform needs to take place and be ratified and enter into force before the enlargement in order to...
And why is there 2030 the deadline for enlargement? I wouldn't know that.
The President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission has suggested that the enlargement process may have 2030 as the date where this new Big Bang with this big enlargement may eventually take place. So if this is agreed by the member states, it means that the reform has to be completed, ratified, and entered into force by 2029. This means that the European legislature 2024-2029 is essentially a constituent legislature, where we'll have the convention and we'll have to ratify the proposal. Why it's important? Why we always say that enlargement is important, and we all want enlargement, but we need to be prepared for enlargement. Because if today...
I'm not so sure whether I want enlargement, to be honest. I mean, look, we enlarged Turkey, we took it for 60 years and we claimed for democracy and everything. And now Ukraine, I mean, we can discuss, but Ukraine is not a really liberal nor a real democratic country. So getting Ukraine within 6 years into the European Union, I honestly don't know whether that's a good idea.
So far, the enlargement has been the best instrument and incentive for non-EU countries to democratize, to make reform in a liberal sense, to establish the rule of law, because if they don't, they won't be allowed to join the union. So the idea of negotiating with a deadline that is not a deadline that you'll enter anyway, because if you haven't managed to democratize, set up a rule of law system and so on, you cannot join the union, but at least provide a very strong incentive for all these countries in the Western Balkans and so on to move in that direction, like it happened for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe.
But there is a difference between Montenegro and Ukraine. I mean, in terms of size, in terms of agricultural policy, and then these countries are preparing since 15 years.
That's the point. That's why it's so difficult. Ukraine has a war and so on. So it's very difficult. It's a very ambitious task that the EU has set itself. We don't know if we'll manage. But anyway, that we manage or we don't manage, we have to prepare ourselves, because if we manage, we need to be ready. And of course, if we are unable to decide by unanimity with 27 members, it would be even more impossible with 30, 34, 36. Furthermore, let's take Ukraine as an example. Let's make a thought experiment that today Ukraine was a member state of the European Union. After what Ukraine has endured with the Russian invasion, for at least 3 generations, all Ukrainians will hate Russians, which means that on any decision that requires unanimity, the Ukrainian government would put a veto, provided it has its way regarding a completely different issue, which is the European Union relationship with Russia, because any form of cooperation would be unacceptable for the most part of the Ukrainian citizens.
But it's already most unacceptable for the Poles or the Estonians or the Lithuanians.
Things about the Ukraine. So this would mean that for geographical reason, once this war is finally ended, we'll need to find some security architecture for Europe that involves also Russia, because it's our neighbor.
Obviously. I mean, this is what we are telling since 91 and the Paris Charter and so on and so forth. Yeah, we need to go back to peace with Russia.
Have unanimity on anything, because that unanimity would be used by Ukraine to blackmail the whole EU regarding the Russian policy. But this is not because the Ukrainians are bad, because we can all sympathize and understand the reason why it will be this way. Because Ukraine has been brutally aggressed by Russia in a 19th century way. But still, there may be a core union like the Euro area and so on that is fully federalized, and there may be member states that are unwilling to go into this kind of deep integration, want to remain in the current EU or the single market and so on. So we'll probably need to set up a system of concentric circle, different speed integration. And there was a document by some expert nominated by the French and German government that proposed to set up a 4-circle Europe with a sort of federal core as the first circle, the current EU as the second circle, the single market or the European Economic Area as the first circle, and European political community, where there is just some discussion and cooperation on security issue as the last circle. It is possible that in the convention, with the proposal of the Parliament, this perspective will be taken up if some member states of the EU are unwilling to go forward with the deepening of integration and want to remain at the current level. So this is something that may be taken up.
Okay, but may I just say that we are hanging around with these proposals of inner circle, outer circles, and so geometry variable, and how was it called, for 20 years, and it was never sort of successful, and it never ended anyway. So I'm perhaps a little bit more skeptical than you. But what I want to come to, because we are running a little bit out of time, is the central point of the proposal, which is, I guess you wanted to come to it right now, the question of a European-wide referendum.
The proposal established European referendum, but so far the amendment that proposed to use the European referendum as a tool for ratification has not been approved by AFCO, because the various parties that support the proposal, not all of them supported this one. The European People Party and Renew Europe didn't vote for the proposal to use the European referendum as the tool for ratification. So currently the text provides for ratification by 4/5 of the member states instead of the current requirement of unanimity. I think this may create a political and legal nightmare, because what will happen if we get 4/5 of the member states that ratify the reform, but for example France, like in 2005, holds a referendum where there is no discussion about the reform, but is only used for domestic purpose to give a blow to the president and the government. Then we would have a no in France against ratification by summing up the votes of all the opposition, whatever the reform in discussion. And I think it would be very difficult for all the others to decide to go ahead without France. So the proposal that was tabled by some MEPs and that I'd supported in my writing and my academic stuff is to have a European-wide referendum to ratify.
Complementary European-wide referendum. So basically it's a double counting. Can you just explain this?
If we establish the European referendum that will have double majority, so European majority and national majority in a majority of member states, then we should use this to ratify, because when should we call European citizens to express themselves in a referendum as European citizens, if not about the constitutional rules of their being European citizens? So if there is a reform, we as European citizens should decide if we want to ratify with a referendum with double majority, a European majority and a national majority in a majority of member states. And if we have this double majority, this is ratified. I think this presents two advantages. The first one is that it becomes clear for everybody that the referendum cannot be used for domestic purposes. Second, that is more democratic compared to current ratification system by national parliament someplace, by national referendum in another, and so on. Third, my suggestion is that if there is a double majority, this is ratified, and all the countries where there was a majority will certainly go ahead. Because if one country doesn't have a majority in favor, nobody can tell its own citizen that their vote is less valuable than the only country that voted against. So this way we are sure...
Which is the basic notion of democracy. It's one person, one vote. Every person counts the same. Yeah, and independently of identity, origin, and background and whatever.
And then my proposal that was proposed by some MEPs, and I would like to thank them all, was also that if there is a European majority and a national majority in a majority member state is ratified, but in those member states where there was not a national majority to ratify, they would be allowed to vote again within 6 months to decide if they want to ratify or if they want to leave the union or to join eventually a different circle of integration if this will be part of the reform. For instance, they want to stay only in the current EU without the reform one, or in the single market without the EU. That's fine, but we cannot allow a single country that votes against to block all the others, because this is against democracy. If the European citizen, there is a European majority of citizens and national majority in a majority of member state, this is ratified and we go ahead. By the way, this idea of multi-speed Europe, this is a reality, because everything we have done in Europe was actually done this way. The European Parliament direct election initially were decided only by 7 of the 9 member states of the time. The euro area, the monetary union, was set up by 11 member states only. Now we reach 20.
Yeah, but Roberto, it's basically the 2/3 majority, which is the majority for constitutional changes, because if you have unanimity, you never do a constitutional change. So it's very high time that the European Union shifts to something like 2/3 majority for constitutional changes.
For 5th, so it's an even higher threshold. But I would also like to stress one point. Many people say that this would be a breakup of the current legal system that requires for unanimity. I would like to stress 3 historical precedents. The first one is the United States. when the United States moved from the first constitution after the Independence War, the Articles of Confederation, to the new federal constitution set up by the Philadelphia Convention, that constitution had its own rule about ratification that provided for qualified majority and not unanimity, like the Articles of Confederation. And in fact, many people forget that the American Constitution was not done between the 13 former colonies, but between 11, because 2 of them did not ratify the Constitution and only ratified that 2 years later and joined it later. The second example is Switzerland. Switzerland was a confederation that required unanimity for the reform of the treaties, but in the 19th century they made a reform and became a federal system, and that reform included a clause that provides for ratification by qualified majority once again. And in the European Union we have the precedent of 2000 of the euro area crisis. We were negotiating the setup of the European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact. The United Kingdom put a veto, so this was impossible. So what the member states did, they made those treaties formally outside the EU legal order, but the treaties mentioned that use the European Union institutions, the Commission, the Central Bank, and so on, and provide for their inclusion in the legal system of the EU within 5 years. So what was that if not a breakup of the legal system by circumventing the United Kingdom veto? And furthermore,
the British, the United,
provide for ratification by minority, because those treaties were signed by 25 member states. At the time, there were 18 members of the euro area. So ratification was provided by 12 member states, provided they were member of the euro area, which means that was 2/3 of the euro area, but was a minority of the signatoring country, because they were 25. So we were ratifying the European Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact by minority. This shows that when there is the political will, because it is essential for Europeans to do certain things, there was such a crisis that it was essential to set up the European Stability Mechanism, we can find a way to do it. I believe that today it is essential for the European Union to reform itself, to overcome unanimity, to set up a fully fledged democratic federal system, to answer the demands of the citizen expressed in the Conference on the Future of Europe about public goods regarding climate change, security and defense, migration, economic policy, investment, financial, the green transition, digital transition. These are the questions of the citizen. And this reform is there to provide the citizen with the answer they asked, with the answer they need. So this is a great initiative by the European Parliament, which I hope all European citizens, all civil society will support. And I also hope that the plenary of the Parliament will actually support the amendments about using the European referendum as the real instrument for ratification, because this makes all the difference.
Super, Roberto. So this was a super Schlusswort, like we say in German. High time for the European citizens, the listeners of the European Citizens Radio, so all of you have been following Roberto now, to understand that we are experiencing a very, very important moment in time to secure the European functioning. So this will happen in the 21st December in the European plenary with a vote about decision making. We will see whether the European system is launching a convention. We will see what the convention will do, which might be created by January 25, what Roberto just explained to us. And then we must basically break through having a European federal system, breaking through unanimity, breaking through veto possibilities to just have what? A Europe that suits us, the European citizens, a Europe that is democratic, in which we decide and nobody can block us to do things we do not want to have. So I'm very happy. I mean, I hope we can contribute a little bit to make a very, very dry materia. I admit it's really, really dry to look at treaty change revisions, Article 48, but perhaps we triggered you a little bit, and we triggered you that this is not just abstract stuff, but it basically concerns each and every of your future, and a future for a better democratic, social and so forth Europe that can can provide to the European citizens the future and the public goods that we all want to have. Roberto, I'm deeply thankful that you took the time to walk us in a very pedagogical way. So all these, tricky, stuffy issues. And I hope we have a little bit more readers for your, you find Roberto Castaldi obviously in the internet, everything you heard and perhaps you didn't understand really, go search him, look at his papers. There is a lot of reading stuff about these things. And we have a couple of months to go with the European Citizens Radio to accompany this process. With this, I say arrivederci, Roberto, to Bella Italia.
Thank you so much for
Grazie mille.
I'm a citizen of Europe.
Sono cittadina europea.
Ich bin europäischer Bürger.
This podcast is only possible because of you. The countless viewers and listeners support our work through donations. If you would also like to contribute to the success of this project, please click on the corresponding button on our website www.europeandemocracylab.org. Thank you.
Esso Europiete.
Sunt cetățean al Europei.
Ja, graștancă Европы.
Я громадянка Європи.
Esso Europiete.
Moi, je suis un citoyen européen.